The first thing I remember is the sharp, unnatural taste of oxygen forced down my throat and the overwhelming glare of fluorescent lights in a room that hummed with the low, ceaseless murmur of machines. When I opened my eyes, every inch of me ached, but the worst pain bloomed deep in my chest. A raw, radiating fire I knew could only mean the surgeons had done their work. My mind was foggy, but in that fog, there was one cold, hard fact. I was still alive. As awareness trickled back, I searched the sterile hospital room in Portland, hoping for some hint of warmth, some sign that the world outside still cared. All I saw were blank white walls, medical charts hanging like unspoken judgments, and my own name, Frank Harris, scribbled on a dry erase board above a schedule of medication and physical therapy sessions. I waited for a familiar face, a nurse, a friend, anyone at all. The loneliness settled over me, heavy as the lead apron they used for x-rays. It took hours before my phone, tucked inside a brown plastic bag with my wallet and house keys, was finally placed in my hand by a nurse who barely made eye contact. The first thing I did, even before checking the damage to my body, was unlock the screen and look for messages. Not a single notification from my wife, Linda. Not a word from Jacob, my only son. My thumb hovered over our family group chat, a digital space that once buzzed with birthday wishes, photos of backyard barbecues, and the trivial banter of ordinary days. I typed out a simple message. Who can pick me up when they release me? Then I waited, feeling the pressure of time crawling, each minute magnifying my sense of dread. The reply came quicker than I expected, but it landed like a slap. Just call a lift, Dad. I'm catching the game, Jacob texted. 10 seconds later, Linda chimed in, her tone as light as a summer breeze. Honestly, Frank, maybe you should stay a little longer. It's peaceful at home for once. That was all. 2 sentences. I sat there, numb, staring at words that could have been written to a stranger. For a moment, my vision blurred. Not from the medication, but from the sudden clarity that hit me harder than any heart attack. It wasn't just that they weren't coming. It was the sense that my absence was a gift to them. It was as if my near death had made life easier, lighter, more pleasant in ways they weren't ashamed to confess. A chill crept up my spine, despite the warm hospital blankets. I tried to convince myself it was the drugs or stress, or maybe even a misunderstanding, but my heart knew better. There had always been a gap, a subtle growing distance that had turned our family ties into something brittle, ready to snap with the slightest pressure. But to witness it, here at the very edge of my mortality, was something I never could have prepared for. My mind tumbled backward through the years, searching for a moment, any moment, that might have predicted this level of indifference. Couldn't find one, not really. All I could remember were the sacrifices, the little ones and the big ones, the way I'd worked overtime through the winters of the 90s to pay off our first mortgage, the way I'd sold my dream motorcycle so Jacob could have a decent first car, the trips Linda insisted on taking that always left me with less, but always believing that giving was what made a man worthy of his family. I'd poured myself out for them, bit by bit, year after year, always trusting it would matter, even if I didn't say it aloud. That night, the darkness in my room felt absolute. The clock ticked on, indifferent, while outside the hospital window the city of Portland glowed in distant orange, a reminder that the world moved on with or without me. Sleep came in short, broken patches, interrupted by pain and the subtle terror that nobody would be there when I woke. The following day, a patient was wheeled into the other half of my room. A wiry old man named Charles, who'd lost a foot to diabetes and greeted me with a knowing nod. We didn't talk much at first, but as the days passed, Charles began to share stories. He talked about family, his kids scattered across 3 states, barely calling, only showing up to discuss his will or to ask about money. There was a sad wisdom in his voice, and when he said, "You know, Frank, sometimes the people you give the most to are the ones who forget you first," I felt a slow, cold recognition settle into my bones. It was a truth I wasn't ready to face, but one I couldn't deny. The things we build for our loved ones can be torn down quietly, invisibly, until one day we realize the foundation's already gone. I spent long hours in that bed, listening to the hiss of oxygen, the beep of the monitors, the muffled conversations of nurses in the hallway. I became obsessed with watching the door, half expecting, half hoping anyone, would walk in and prove me wrong. But the only visitors I had were professionals. The social worker with polite but detached questions, the cardiac rehab nurse with her clipboard, the chaplain who offered a blessing I didn't feel worthy of. Each time my phone buzzed, I felt a stab of hope, but it was never Linda or Jacob, just reminders about appointments or insurance forms, or some spammer trying to sell me a medic alert system. I started to notice things I'd ignored for years. The way the nurses looked at me, sometimes with pity, sometimes with the brisk efficiency reserved for lost causes. The way the cleaning crew barely acknowledged me as they changed the trash. The way my own reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror seemed thinner, paler, diminished in some essential way. I realized I'd become invisible, not just to my family, but to everyone. I remembered an old saying, something about dying twice, once when you stop breathing and again when someone says your name for the last time. For the first time in my life, I wondered which death I was closer to. But pain can be a clarifier, and over those days, as my chest healed and my heart learned its new rhythm, a different kind of resolve began to take root. I started paying attention to every detail, my own insurance, my bank balances, the fine print in the hospital paperwork. I asked questions the nurses weren't expecting, made notes in a small yellow pad I kept hidden under my pillow. I stopped waiting for someone else to rescue me. Something in Charles's words haunted me. Maybe you're supposed to rescue yourself. The day before my discharge, I watched the January rain beating against the window and thought about the life that was waiting for me outside those doors. What would it mean to go home? What would I return to? A house that had never felt emptier, a marriage that had slowly congealed into routine, a son who saw me as little more than a safety net. I tried to imagine walking through my own front door, feeling grateful just to survive, only to be met by silence or, worse, by the unspoken irritation that I dared to come back at all. On my last night, I drafted one more message in the family chat. Leaving the hospital tomorrow. Would love a ride, but I can manage if you're busy. I almost didn't hit send, but curiosity got the better of me. The answer was even shorter than before. Whatever you need, Dad. Just let us know how much the cab is. A message so empty, so devoid of care, that for a second, I wondered if they were even real people at all or just characters playing out some tired script I'd helped write. And yet, beneath the numbness, something started to burn. A small, clean anger, sharper than the scalpels that had opened my chest. It was anger not just at Linda or Jacob, but at myself for letting it go on so long, for mistaking sacrifice for love, duty for devotion, habit for hope. As I lay awake that night, listening to Charles's soft snores and the rain drumming the window, I realized that the only thing more frightening than being forgotten was the possibility of never fighting for myself at all. The next morning, as I signed the discharge forms with a shaky hand, the nurse smiled politely, telling me to take it easy and call if anything felt wrong. I looked back at the bed, at Charles who gave me a parting wink, and I understood that a door had quietly closed behind me, maybe forever. The city outside was cold and wet, but the air tasted different, almost electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm. My ride, a taxi, not my family, pulled up to the curb. I slid into the back seat, feeling the stitches in my chest tug, and stared out at the world as it sped by, everything suddenly sharper, clearer, more real than ever before. I had no idea what I would do next, only that whatever came would be on my terms. For the first time in decades, a strange thrill ran through me. Something was coming, and this time I was finally ready for it. Some memories refused to fade, no matter how hard you try to bury them beneath years of hard work and routine. When I sat in the back of that taxi, the Portland drizzle streaking across the window, I found myself tumbling backward through decades of my own life. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was more like a haunting, an inventory of everything I'd ever done for people who now treated me as if I barely existed. The ache in my chest wasn't just from the surgery. It was from the slow, bitter realization that my sacrifices had become invisible, that somehow the currency of love I'd paid in for so many years had been quietly devalued without anyone telling me. The taxi driver was an older man, maybe in his 70s, his hands rough and steady on the wheel. He glanced at me in the mirror and asked if I'd had a rough night. I wanted to laugh but couldn't quite find the energy. Instead, I told him the truth: heart surgery, no visitors, family busy living their own lives. He nodded like he'd heard it 100 times before and turned up the heater. The ride home was silent, except for the faint jazz on the radio. I watched the city slip by, gray and indifferent, the traffic lights casting patterns on the damp pavement, everything ordinary and unremarkable. But inside, the silence was roaring. As we crossed the Willamette River, I remembered the first time Linda and I drove into Portland together, her hair blowing wild in the wind, our son Jacob in the back seat, a chubby toddler still clapping at every truck we passed. We'd just closed on our first house in Beaverton, a tiny 2-bedroom with a leaky roof, but it was ours. We celebrated with cheap burgers and milkshakes, toasted the future with promises and laughter. For years, I believed those moments were the seeds of something permanent, that no matter how hard the wind blew, the roots would hold. I worked every job I could find, sometimes 2 at once. Laying concrete in the rain, repairing old furnaces for elderly neighbors who couldn't pay much, scraping by but always keeping the mortgage current. I told myself, every sacrifice is a brick in the foundation of this family. The years marched forward. We traded that little house for something bigger, something with a yard and enough space for Jacob to run wild. There were backyard barbecues with the neighbors, 4th of July fireworks, Thanksgiving dinners with way too much pie and football games blaring in the background. Linda would sit at the kitchen table, her laughter the anchor of every gathering. Even when money was tight, she found ways to make it all feel abundant. A new tablecloth, a special recipe clipped from a magazine, tiny gestures that said, "We're in this together." There were hard times, of course. I missed promotions I deserved, lost jobs I needed, watched as my hands grew calloused and my back stiffened. Still, I pressed on, convinced that devotion was its own kind of reward. Jacob grew up fast. Too fast. He was smart but restless, always chasing the next distraction. There were report cards pinned to the fridge, trophies lined up on his dresser, and, eventually, arguments about curfews and car keys. I still remember the day he turned 16. His eyes gleaming as he tore the bow off the used Honda I bought with my overtime pay. He didn't thank me, not really, but I didn't care. That was how it was for fathers. You gave and you gave and you hoped the meaning would dawn on them eventually. Maybe when they had kids of their own. If I'm honest, there were warning signs, cracks in the perfect picture I never wanted to see. The way Linda sometimes rolled her eyes when I talked about work. The way Jacob avoided family dinners as soon as he could drive himself to the movies. The subtle shift in Linda's voice when she talked about vacations she wanted to take. Places I couldn't afford without borrowing, destinations that somehow never included me. But I ignored it, wrote it off as growing pains or the inevitable drift of time. After all, I'd seen my own parents struggle through rough patches and come out the other side. I believed in the story of endurance. As the taxi neared my neighborhood, the streets blurred together, familiar but suddenly foreign. It was almost dusk when I paid the driver and walked up the front steps of my house. The porch light was off, the mailbox overflowing with flyers and past due bills. I stood there for a moment, keys in hand, trying to summon the old feeling of coming home. But all I felt was a heaviness, a sense of trespassing in a place that no longer belonged to me. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. The air smelled faintly of Linda's favorite vanilla candles, but there was no warmth in it. The living room looked different, somehow rearranged in my absence. Furniture shifted, my old recliner missing. On the kitchen table, I found a pile of unopened mail, some of it addressed to Jacob, most of it bills in my name. There was a note from Linda. Went out with the girls. There's leftover pizza. No, welcome home. No, how are you feeling? Just the bare minimum. I wandered down the hallway to what used to be my home office, a space I'd carved out over years. A battered desk, a wall lined with photographs, shelves of books collected from used stores and garage sales. Now, half the shelves were gone, replaced by bins of Jacob's electronics, wires spilling out in tangled knots. My desk was buried beneath boxes labeled, Etsy, ship ASAP. I recognized Linda's handwriting. It struck me that I'd become a guest in my own house, my presence tolerated only until it got in the way of someone else's plans. I pulled an old photo from a half-empty box. Jacob as a boy, sitting on my shoulders at Cannon Beach, both of us grinning, the sky behind us impossibly blue. There was a time when I believed that love was unbreakable, that you could measure a family's worth in moments like this. But as I looked at the picture, I saw it differently now. I saw a man pouring everything he had into people who were already turning away. I made my way back to the kitchen, hoping the routine of making coffee would ground me, bring back some sense of normalcy. But the cupboards were nearly empty, just a few mugs and a half-open box of stale cereal. Linda must have cleaned out the fridge before she left. I found a single slice of pizza, cold and congealed, and forced it down, swallowing with more effort than I cared to admit. As I ate, I listened to the faint sound of music drifting from Jacob's room. Something loud and defiant, the anthem of someone who had never learned gratitude. After dinner, I sat alone in the dim light, sorting through stacks of old bills and receipts. I found documents I didn't remember signing, bank forms, power of attorney notices, even a pre-approval for a second mortgage. My name was on everything, but the handwriting on the signatures looked suspiciously unlike my own. I felt a slow, simmering anger begin to build, mixing with the hurt and confusion until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. It was late when Linda came home. She was all smiles, cheeks flushed from wine and laughter, breezing past me on her way to the bedroom. She asked if I'd eaten, but didn't wait for an answer. I wanted to confront her, to ask what had happened to us, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just watched her disappear down the hall, the door closing softly behind her. I felt like a ghost haunting the edges of my own life, visible only when it was convenient for others. Sleep was nearly impossible that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations in my head, searching for the moment when everything had started to unravel. The sound of rain against the window was relentless, each drop a tiny hammer tapping out the truth. Sometime after midnight, I heard Jacob on the phone, his voice low and urgent. I caught a few words: debt, transfer, Dad's account. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with a terrible clarity. The pieces were falling into place. In the days that followed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Linda spent her mornings on video calls, laughing with friends about plans for a vacation I hadn't even heard about. Jacob barely left his room except to demand money or to raid the fridge. There were arguments about bills, about my insistence on keeping the thermostat low to save money, about why I was always in the way. Each conversation felt like an audition for a part one no longer fit. One afternoon, I overheard Linda and Jacob in the garage, their voices sharp and conspiratorial. "If we get him to sign the right forms, we can finally pay off everything and start fresh," Linda whispered. Jacob replied, "He won't even notice. He's too tired to fight." That night, I sat in my car outside the house, the rain pounding on the windshield, and let myself feel it all: the grief, the betrayal, the slow, steady death of trust. I thought about all the things I'd given up, the dreams deferred, the small joys traded for the bigger picture I thought was worth painting. There had been chances, moments when I could have chosen myself, but I always turned away. For Linda, for Jacob, for the hope that it would all mean something in the end. As the days blurred together, I realized the person I missed most was the man I used to be. The one who believed that love was an investment that always paid dividends. The one who could find meaning in every sacrifice. But now, in the clear, cold light of experience, I saw things as they really were. I had built a house on sand, and the tide was coming in. That's when a strange, dangerous idea began to take root. Maybe, just maybe, the time had come to stop giving, to stop explaining, to stop forgiving the unforgivable. Maybe the most radical thing I could do, after a lifetime of sacrifice, was to save myself. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in years, I felt awake, electric, alive with the possibility of change. I had no plan yet, only the knowledge that something had to give. And as I sat there, staring at my own reflection in the rain-blurred window. I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The next few weeks blurred together, days and nights stitched by routines that now felt like someone else's life. My body healed by increments, but my mind became sharper, restless. I woke early every morning, an old habit I'd never shaken, and wandered the quiet house with the uneasy feeling that the walls were closing in. I saw Linda less and less. She left the house before sunrise, heading out with her gym bag or her book club notes, returning late with a hollow smile and the scent of wine lingering in her hair. Jacob stayed locked in his room, computer monitors casting blue shadows under the door, the sounds of voices and laughter from his endless online games drowning out any sense of family. My presence in the house was met with the polite indifference of strangers on a city bus. Even the family dog, Daisy, seemed to have chosen her loyalties, trailing after Linda as if sensing some invisible line had been drawn in the carpet. Each day brought a new realization, small but sharp, that this place was no longer mine. Not really. It was a motel for them, a storage locker for Jacob's gadgets, a set piece in Linda's social media posts about her home. I became invisible in my own kitchen, my own living room, my own marriage. One Sunday morning, the air heavy with coastal rain, Linda announced she'd organized a family lunch for Jacob's birthday. I barely recognized the guest list. Distant cousins, Jacob's old college friends, a woman who ran the local boutique with Linda, and her daughter. Jacob, as usual, contributed little to the preparations, except for requests for what he wanted to eat. I moved through the motions. Grilling chicken, cleaning the deck, pretending to smile as if the simple act of acting like a family might conjure the feeling itself. But as the hours wore on, my discomfort grew. I caught snippets of conversation in the kitchen, Linda recounting stories of our travels, leaving out the times I'd worked overtime to afford even the cheapest motel. She laughed with her friends, her voice syrupy and performative. I realized, with a tight ache, that my entire life had become a backdrop for her ambitions, her curated image of contentment. The party started slow and awkward, the way gatherings do when people are there more out of obligation than affection. I watched Jacob from across the yard, slouched in a deck chair, thumbs flying over his phone. The new friends greeted him, handed over gift bags filled with electronics, sneakers, cash cards. Nobody mentioned the fact that he was 37 and still living at home. No one asked what he did for work. I stood on the fringe, unseen, nursing a glass of lemonade I'd mixed myself, the ice clinking like small reminders of everything that had melted away. As I refilled the grill, Linda drifted over, wrapped in her best party smile. She leaned close, voice low. "Try not to bring up any of your medical stuff, okay? It brings the mood down." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. She was already glancing away, waving to a friend, gone before I could answer. I turned back to the sizzling chicken, my heart pounding with something close to rage. Later, as cake was served, the group gathered in the living room, a chorus of laughter and inside jokes swirling around Jacob as he opened gifts. I watched from a corner, ignored, holding the birthday card I'd spent hours choosing, the one that reminded me of when he was small and we used to build kites together in the backyard. I handed it to him quietly, and he took it without looking up. He tossed it onto the pile with a distracted "Thanks, Dad," and then went back to showing off his new headphones. For a moment, I was 13 again, longing for someone to notice me, to acknowledge the effort it took just to keep showing up. Instead, I felt smaller than ever. After the guests left, Linda stayed busy cleaning, bustling from room to room, still riding the high of playing hostess. I lingered on the deck, the sky darkening as the rain let up, the air thick with the scent of wet grass. Through the sliding glass door, I heard Jacob and Linda talking. Their voices were low, but anger sharpened my hearing. "If we can get Dad to sign over that investment account, it'll cover the rest of the debt," Jacob said, anxiety trembling in his voice. Linda replied, "He won't argue if you ask at the right moment. He's too tired these days." They were so casual, so certain that I'd comply, so confident that my loyalty could be bartered away like another gift at the party. That night, After everyone was asleep, I couldn't help but wander the house, studying the evidence of my fading place in it. My office had been rearranged again, more of my things boxed up and pushed into the garage. My collection of old baseball cards, inherited from my father, was gone. Linda said she'd organized them, but when I asked where, she shrugged. I checked the safe in the closet, heart sinking as I realized it was unlocked. Important documents were missing: birth certificates, my original will, even the title to my truck. It was as if my life was being erased, piece by piece, behind my back. The final blow came 2 days later when I visited the bank to check on an odd withdrawal I'd noticed on my online statement. The banker, a young woman with a polite, rehearsed smile, explained that Linda had come in with power of attorney paperwork and had emptied the joint savings account to pay off urgent expenses. My signature, she claimed, was on the form, but when I saw the paperwork, my blood ran cold. The signature was a forgery. The date was from the week I'd been in the hospital, unconscious and unable to sign anything. My hands trembled as I tried to explain, but the banker only shrugged, saying these disputes were common and best resolved at home. I walked out of that bank with a hollow feeling in my chest, a new kind of fear simmering beneath the anger. Back home, I found Linda and Jacob at the dining table, bills spread out, calculators clicking. They barely looked up as I entered. Linda said she'd taken care of everything, and that it was time to simplify our finances. Jacob asked if I could co-sign a loan for his friend's business idea, promising it was a sure thing, and that I'd get paid back in no time. I stared at them, wondering how they could look at me and see nothing but a means to an end. As days slipped into nights, I started to notice a shift in myself. I no longer moved quietly to avoid disturbing them. I no longer swallowed the sting of their dismissals. Instead, I began documenting every interaction, photographing documents, saving emails, keeping a notebook in my jacket. I spoke less, listened more. I started visiting the local coffee shop, not just for the caffeine, but for the privacy. There, I read about elder fraud, about families who preyed on their own, about men and women who'd lost everything: money, dignity, hope, to the people they trusted most. One afternoon, I found myself drawn into a conversation with a woman named Rita, a retired nurse who now ran a support group for seniors. She listened, really listened, as I poured out my story. She nodded, her face grave, and handed me the card of an attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. "You're not alone, Frank," she said, and for the first time in months, I almost believed her. That evening, I watched Jacob leave the house with a duffel bag. Linda was in the living room, laughing at a reality show. On impulse, I logged into my email, an account Linda didn't know about. There, I discovered a message from my cousin, Mark, inviting me to his daughter's wedding in Seattle. He apologized for the late notice and hoped I'd bring the family. I replied that I'd try, then sat back and wondered if I even belonged at such gatherings anymore. My phone buzzed with another text from Jacob, this time asking for my login info for my brokerage account, claiming he needed it for research. It was all so brazen, so shameless. I remembered a night years ago when I'd held Jacob after a nightmare, promising him nothing would ever hurt him as long as I was around. I remembered the way Linda had once looked at me, as if I were the answer to a question she'd only just learned to ask. Now, those memories felt distant, fragile, almost fictional, but they fueled a growing determination, a refusal to let the last act of my life be written by someone else's greed. The days ticked by, each one carving a deeper groove of isolation and resolve. I watched the people I loved act as if I were a piece of furniture, something to be rearranged or sold or ignored, and I realized that the only way out was through the lies, the manipulation, the quiet thefts, the betrayal that had hollowed out our family from the inside. I thought about the man I'd been, the man I still wanted to be. I promised myself I wouldn't let them take what little dignity I had left. On a rainy Thursday, I set an appointment with Rita's attorney. I locked the safe, moved my remaining valuables to a bank deposit box Jacob and Linda couldn't access, and began compiling a record of everything I'd discovered. I didn't know what would happen next. I just knew I wasn't done fighting. And as I walked out into the rain, feeling the cold drops slide down my face, I sensed that the storm was only just beginning. When I look back, I think the turning point wasn't a single moment, but a slow accumulation, a tide rising grain by grain until you wake up to find the old shoreline erased. The day I sat in that lawyer's waiting room, hands trembling, heart pounding harder than after the surgery, I finally understood the cost of pretending everything was fine. The office was simple but dignified, the kind of place where old pain went to be recognized. Rita's attorney, Matthew Sloan, was a compact man with a grave face and the kind of eyes that saw right through excuses. He listened quietly as I laid out the story, the forged signature, the missing funds, the constant humiliation of being treated as an afterthought in my own home. He didn't flinch or pity me. He just nodded, took notes, and asked precise questions. The comfort I felt in that room was sharp and unfamiliar. I wasn't just a problem to be solved. I was someone whose story mattered. Over the following weeks, I became a student of my own defense. Matthew explained the steps: freezing joint accounts, documenting every transaction, establishing legal protection for my assets. Felt like learning a foreign language. Each phone call, each trip to the bank, each notary visit was a reminder that I'd allowed myself to drift on the goodwill of others for too long. Now, every signature, every certified letter, was a brick in a wall I was building around myself. I started carrying a small folder everywhere I went, thick with statements, legal notices, copies of documents that proved I was not yet erased. I learned how easy it had been to hand over the keys to my life, and how much harder it was to take them back. The most difficult part was the silence. I couldn't tell Linda or Jacob what I was doing. I played my role, ate meals in stiff politeness, nodded at their stories, let them believe I was slipping away. It was a strange kind of acting, one that required me to bury my anger and my need for confrontation. Instead, I found a dark satisfaction in watching them underestimate me. Linda continued her routines, her charity events, her gossip, her plans for the house. Jacob came and went, looking more and more nervous as the weeks wore on. I noticed the stacks of unopened mail, the late notices from credit card companies. He asked me, casually, if I'd considered putting the house in his name for tax reasons. I smiled and told him I'd think about it. The old Frank might have laughed or gotten angry. This new Frank made a note, marked the date, added it to the file. It was during this period of quiet gathering that I began to realize how many others shared my story. Rita encouraged me to join her support group, a collection of men and women, many older than me, some younger, all with stories of being cast aside by those they loved most. We met at the community center every Tuesday night, sitting in a circle of uncomfortable chairs, telling truths that never made it into Christmas cards or family newsletters. I listened to a retired teacher who'd been moved to a nursing home by his children, then had his pension rerouted. I listened to a woman whose granddaughter drained her savings with online scams. I saw myself in every story: the shame, the confusion, the fear, the guilt of wondering if you'd somehow brought it all on yourself. One night after the meeting, I found myself talking to Rita in the parking lot, rain hissing on the blacktop. She told me about her own family, a son she hadn't seen in a decade, a house she'd lost to foreclosure, the anger that finally burned hot enough to forge a new beginning. "It never gets easy," she said, "but you do get stronger." Her words followed me home, echoing in the silent car, competing with my own doubts. I wanted to believe that strength was something you could grow at any age, even after a lifetime of surrender. I started planning in earnest. I reviewed every account, every document, every scrap of evidence that might be used against me or for me. With Matthew's help, I drew up a new will, one that made my wishes unmistakably clear. The house, the savings, the retirement accounts, even the old truck. Everything would be transferred into a living trust, to be managed by a small charity I created in memory of my late sister, Helen. She was the only person who had never asked anything from me, the one who used to tell me, "Frank, you have to set boundaries, or people will build fences around your life and leave you out in the yard." The trust would guarantee my needs were met, and that when I was gone, what remained would go to something bigger than Jacob's debts or Linda's shopping trips. A part of me, the old reflexive part, felt guilty for hiding all this. I would catch myself staring at Linda's back as she folded laundry, wondering if there was a version of this story where things could be repaired. But each time, the memory of that forged signature, the easy dismissal in her voice, reminded me why the walls were necessary. Some betrayals could not be mended with time or apology. With the legal defenses in place, Matthew suggested I document my experience, not just for court, but for others who might find themselves where I was. I started keeping a journal, describing every indignity, every act of theft. Every night I felt small and erased. The writing was cathartic, but it was also an act of preservation, a way of refusing to let the story end with my silence. Rita read the first pages and suggested I share them with a local reporter, someone she knew from her days as a nurse. At first, I balked at the idea of going public, of exposing the rot in my family to strangers. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the power of naming things, of refusing to hide anymore. The reporter, Michelle Tan, was gentle and exacting, never pushing for drama, only for truth. She promised to tell my story with dignity, to focus not on scandal but on survival. The day the story ran, a subtle shift crept into the house. Linda was restless, flinching at her phone, scanning news sites with a nervousness she tried to hide. Jacob was more volatile than ever, slamming doors, blaming me for every frustration. There were whispers from neighbors, cautious looks at the grocery store, even a few awkward phone calls from distant relatives who had read the piece online. I said nothing, keeping my answers polite but brief. The tension in the air was almost electric, as if the whole house was waiting for a storm. One evening, Linda cornered me in the kitchen. Her voice was soft, almost tender, but the edge was unmistakable. She accused me of overreacting, of embarrassing the family, of ruining Jacob's future. I listened to her spin a new story, one where I was the villain for trying to protect myself. I felt the anger bubble up, then watched it cool into a steady, calm certainty. I told her the truth, that trust, once broken, is not so easily patched, that some debts are never repaid. She left in a fury, slamming the door, and I stood there alone, feeling a strange peace settle over me. The next week, official letters began to arrive. Notices from the bank, the court, the title company. Matthew had moved quickly, securing restraining orders on the accounts, transferring the deed to the trust, locking down every asset that wasn't already gone. I watched as Linda and Jacob tried to access funds, only to be denied. Their confusion turned to outrage, their outrage to pleading, then threats. I kept a careful record of every word, every message. The house felt colder, the silences longer, the divide between us now carved in granite. But beneath the tension, I discovered a kind of hope I hadn't felt in years. I started sleeping better, waking early, going for long walks in the neighborhood. I reconnected with an old friend from high school, Dan, who invited me out to Monterey to visit his small cottage on the coast. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine a life outside of this struggle, a life where I was not defined by the needs or judgments of others. As the days grew longer and spring crept over the city, the feeling of possibility grew with it. I spent hours planning trips I'd always postponed, sorting through photos of places I'd promised myself I'd visit someday. I started volunteering at the senior center, fixing things, sharing coffee, listening to stories. I found myself smiling more, even laughing sometimes, the sharp edges of the past softening as the future stretched open before me. Linda and Jacob noticed the change, and for a while they tried new tactics. Jacob promised to look for work. Linda hinted at counseling. But I saw through it, the desperation in their eyes, the calculations behind every gesture. I had spent decades being manipulated by guilt, by obligation, by the myth that family owed each other everything. Now, at last, I understood that self-respect was not selfishness. I owed myself the chance to finish my life on my own terms. When the final papers arrived, confirming the transfer of all assets to the trust, I stood in the middle of the living room, sunlight pouring through the windows, and felt something shift inside me. The weight of years lifted, replaced by a fierce, quiet pride. Whatever happened next, I knew this. I was done being erased. My story would not end as a cautionary tale, but as a declaration. A promise to myself that, no matter how late, you can always choose to begin again. The air in the house seemed to thicken, like some invisible hand had squeezed the walls closer together, letting no comfort through. Linda's footsteps echoed in the hallway. Quick, clipped, almost frantic as she paced between rooms. Phone pressed to her ear in desperate calls to the bank and her friends. Jacob's anger, once sharp and quick, had dulled into a brooding silence. He spent his hours slumped at the kitchen table, thumbing through his phone, his eyes darting toward me whenever I entered the room, his body tense with resentment and fear. Every meal was a tense negotiation of silence, each of us orbiting the others, waiting for the next disaster. One rainy afternoon, a thick envelope slid through the front door. I heard it land on the welcome mat, an ironic word now. I bent to retrieve it, my hands steady, my heart beating in a way that felt almost foreign after months of uncertainty. The return address was the courthouse. I carried it to the kitchen and sat down, sunlight slanting across the floor as I slid it open. The official tone of the summons was almost soothing in its formality. A hearing had been scheduled regarding the misuse of power of attorney, the forged documents, the unauthorized transfer of funds. There were consequences now, not just warnings. I felt something shift inside, a blend of relief, vindication, and a raw edge of grief for all the years I'd spent believing that love could survive any betrayal. Linda found me at the table, papers spread out in front of me. She tried to laugh it off at first, her voice trembling as she insisted it was a misunderstanding. But when I looked at her, really looked, she shrank before my eyes, her confidence slipping. Jacob lurked in the hallway, listening, arms folded tight against his chest. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. Instead, I spoke in the calm, measured way that comes only after you've rehearsed your lines in 1,000 sleepless nights. I told them what would happen next. I explained that the house was no longer theirs to sell, the accounts were no longer theirs to drain, that the trust would take care of me, and that whatever remained would go to causes they'd never cared to understand. The shock hit them unevenly. Linda wept, pleading for one more chance, spinning stories about family and forgiveness. Jacob railed against the unfairness, blaming me for ruining his life, demanding to know how I could do this to my own blood. Their pain was real, but it was the pain of losing privilege, not love. For years, I had absorbed every slight, every manipulation, every demand, because I'd believed it was my duty to shield them from pain. Now, I saw how that shield had only enabled their worst instincts. For the first time, I realized that their disappointment was not a tragedy. It was justice. As word spread, the outside world crept in. The news story Michelle Tan had published was picked up by other outlets. Neighbors stopped to ask questions when I went for my morning walks, their curiosity edged with sympathy, sometimes embarrassment. Some offered awkward comfort, others simply wanted gossip, but I met them all with a measured dignity I hadn't felt in years. Friends from my past reached out. Old union buddies, distant cousins, even Dan from Monterey, whose invitation to visit had once seemed like a fantasy. Now it felt like a lifeline. The tension inside the house thickened with every passing day. I watched as Linda tried every tactic, cajoling, bargaining, threatening. She left brochures for marriage counseling on the table, started making meals again, spoke with an earnestness that rang false. Jacob became sullen, retreating to his room, only emerging to make angry, desperate appeals. He insisted he would find work, swore he would change. But nothing about their desperation was rooted in love. It was all fear, entitlement, the crumbling of a world they'd built on my labor and silence. There were nights when the loneliness pressed down so hard I thought it would smother me. I lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the windows, thinking about Helen, about my parents, about the man I used to be. Guilt surfaced in those quiet hours, whispering that I had abandoned my family, that I had failed them in some fundamental way. But dawn always brought clarity. Each morning I stood in the kitchen, watching the sun climb over the roofs, breathing in the newness of my own resolve. It was a feeling as rare and bright as the first day of spring after a long winter. The hearing came on a clear morning in late April. I wore a suit that hung a little loose from the weight I'd lost, but my shoulders felt squared for the first time in years. Linda sat beside her attorney, her face pale, eyes red-rimmed. Jacob fidgeted in the back, his leg bouncing nervously. The judge, a woman with gray hair pulled tight into a bun, listened intently as the lawyers presented the evidence. The forgery was undeniable, the transfers unmistakable. The facts, once so easy to hide in the haze of family dynamics, now stood exposed in black and white. When the judge ruled in my favor, granting me full protection, confirming the legitimacy of the trust, barring them from any further access, I felt a wave of relief and sadness. It was over, not just the battle for my assets, but the illusion of family I'd clung to for so long. Back home, the mood was brittle and silent. Linda wandered the house like a restless ghost, gathering her belongings in cardboard boxes. Jacob barely spoke. The process of packing was messy, frantic. 40 years of shared life dismantled in the course of a week. I watched them load their things into rented cars, the driveway filling with cast-off furniture, boxes of clothes, memories that no longer belonged to anyone. Linda sobbed as she packed up the photo albums. Jacob cursed as he struggled with his old desktop computer, blaming me for every inconvenience. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispering to each other as the spectacle unfolded. Mrs. Leary from across the street brought over a plate of cookies and a gentle hug. She told me she'd always admired my patience. Others avoided eye contact, not wanting to get involved. I accepted the kindness and the avoidance with equal grace. It was strange, the way the world could shrink and expand at the same time. The night before they left, Linda appeared at my bedroom door. She was tired, makeup smudged, clutching an old wedding photo to her chest. Her voice was small, pleading. She spoke about forgiveness, about the years we'd shared, about second chances. For a moment, the weight of history pressed against me. The memories of laughter, of hope, of the promise we'd once made to grow old together. I looked at her, really looked, and felt a flicker of the love that had once defined my life. But that love had been twisted, starved, reduced to a memory. I told her the truth. Forgiveness was possible, but trust would never return. I wished her peace, but not a return. The next morning they were gone. The house was suddenly, completely silent. I wandered from room to room, touching the marks left on walls by old pictures, finding forgotten mementos in drawers. A ticket stub from a Mariners game, a faded drawing from Jacob's childhood, a note Helen had written to me decades before. I let myself cry, alone in the emptiness, but the tears felt clean, like a river finally breaking through a dam. That afternoon, Dan called, inviting me to Monterey again. He'd seen the story on the news, heard about the hearing, and insisted the guest room was ready. I accepted without hesitation. The next week, I packed a small suitcase, locked the house one last time, and drove south along the coast. The miles unwound beneath me, the ocean coming into view, its vastness a promise of something bigger than loss or regret. When I arrived, Dan greeted me with a bear hug, pulling me into his little cottage by the sea. We spent the evening on the porch, watching the sun sink into the Pacific, sharing stories that had nothing to do with betrayal or loss. The air tasted like salt and freedom. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future shaped by possibility, not obligation. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a routine that felt both new and deeply familiar. I walked the rocky shoreline at dawn, learned the names of birds I'd only ever seen in field guides, joined Dan's weekly poker games at the local community center. I volunteered at the library, repaired old furniture for neighbors, started teaching a beginner's class in wood carving. Each day built on the last, the emptiness inside me slowly filling with a quiet satisfaction. I stayed in touch with Rita and the support group, sharing updates, encouraging others to stand up for themselves. The story Michelle wrote sparked conversations across the state, calls from reporters, invitations to speak at workshops, emails from strangers who saw themselves in my struggle. Every so often, the past crept back in. An email from Linda, a voicemail from Jacob, messages filled with anger or apology or longing. I listened, but did not reply. I owed them nothing more than the truth I'd already spoken. My life had been reclaimed, inch, by the choices I made for myself. One bright morning, sitting on the porch with Dan, I realized how far I'd come from the man who had once begged for scraps of affection at his own kitchen table. I was not the victim of my story anymore. I was the author. The world was wide open again, and for the first time in years, I was ready to see what came next. A new season slid into Monterey with a gentle touch, the Pacific winds shifting from sharp and restless to warm and steady, pulling the salt scent further inland each morning. I found my days filled with the kind of quiet routine I'd once envied in others but never believed could belong to me. Dan's cottage, perched on the bluff above the waves, became both haven and school. Each morning, I walked the coast before sunrise, letting the hush of the ocean wash through me, dissolving old sorrows and making space for something I'd never really understood, peace that asked for nothing in return. I watched the sandpipers race the surf and the kelp beds sway beneath the glassy surface. There were no deadlines, no demands, no one expecting me to perform the role of provider or problem solver. For the first time, I was just Frank Harris, no more, no less. Even so, the past was never truly absent. I carried it in the tightening of my chest when I stumbled across a photo tucked inside a borrowed paperback. In the way my hand hovered over my phone on the off chance a message from Jacob or Linda would appear. Their absence was an ache, not a wound, and it no longer dictated my days. I responded only to the world in front of me, to the smiles of strangers at the library, the laughter around the poker table, the hum of the workshop as I taught wood carving to a group of retirees rediscovering the delight of making something beautiful and useless. I'd started to write again. Not the tight, anxious lists and notes of the past year, but letters. Some I mailed, some I kept. Letters to Helen, to my parents, even to Linda, though I never sent them. Writing became a way to untangle the knots of regret and forgiveness, of memory and meaning. I told the truth. My failures and theirs, my pride and my blindness. I wrote about Jacob as a boy, the way he used to press his ear to my chest and listen for my heart, worried he'd lose me before he was ready to let go. I wrote about the hope I'd carried through every disappointment, how long I'd mistaken duty for love, and how, even now, I wished him well on whatever road he walked. Each letter was a release, a stone set down on a trail I no longer needed to walk. Life in Monterey was richer than I'd imagined it could be. Dan became a kind of brother, his good humor and patience a steady antidote to the old poisons. We took day trips into Big Sur and Carmel, lost afternoons to fishing on the pier, played chess in the park with a group of sharp-witted women who refused to let us win out of pity. I saw my reflection in shop windows and barely recognized the man I'd become. Shoulders squared, eyes clear. A man who moved through the world with a dignity that came not from what he owned or who depended on him, but from what he'd learned to carry and, more importantly, set down. Still, every now and then, a new kind of loneliness crept in. Not the desperate isolation of my last months in Portland, but something softer, like nostalgia for a home you can never return to. That feeling deepened when I received an unexpected letter from Jacob. The envelope was fat and messy, the address scrawled in the same looping script he'd used as a child. Inside, I found pages, some typed, most handwritten, telling me about his new job in Sacramento, about his cramped apartment and his efforts to stay afloat, about therapy, debt, and shame. There was an apology, halting and unsure, threaded through the sentences. He didn't ask for anything except a chance to meet, if I was ever willing. I sat with that letter for days, weighing every word, searching myself for anger and finding only exhaustion and a reluctant sort of hope. Dan noticed my distraction, and in his easy way, said nothing until I was ready. On a warm Saturday, I drove north, the coastal highway unraveling beneath the tires like an old memory set free. Sacramento was new to me. Flat, sun-baked, busy in a way that felt far from the hush of the Pacific. I found Jacob waiting outside a small cafe, thinner than I remembered, older in the eyes. He stood when he saw me, nerves flickering across his face, and we shook hands, then sat, talking over coffee as if nothing and everything had changed. He told me about the fallout after the court case, about the years he'd wasted blaming others, the months spent scraping by on temp work, the hollow victories of avoidance and denial. He admitted the truth of what he'd done, the ways he'd let his resentment twist into cruelty. For the first time, I listened not as a father demanding atonement, but as a man recognizing another's frailty. I shared my own failures, my tendency to equate sacrifice with love, my blindness to the ways my protection had stunted his growth. There were apologies on both sides, awkward and incomplete. But as we walked beneath the sycamores afterward, I felt something shift. A beginning, not of the old closeness, but of a new, cautious respect. We didn't promise anything. I didn't offer him money or rescue. He didn't beg for forgiveness or ask to come back. Instead, we agreed to try occasional calls, perhaps a visit to Monterey when he could. As I drove away, I found myself smiling, relieved and sad, proud and wistful. Healing, I realized, was not the return of what had been lost, but the opening of a space where something different might grow. Back in Monterey, life resumed its steady rhythm. The days lengthened into summer, and with Dan's encouragement, I organized a workshop for veterans at the community center, teaching them woodworking as a way to reconnect with their hands and stories. I found myself drawn to their tales of loss, endurance, redemption. We laughed, we worked. Sometimes we just sat in companionable silence, the scent of pine and sawdust filling the air. I realized that the more I gave of myself to strangers, the less I mourned the absence of those who had once taken me for granted. Word of my story kept traveling. Michelle called to ask if I'd consider speaking at a conference for elder rights, and I hesitated, uncertain what good my pain could do for anyone else. But Rita, wise as ever, told me the act of telling, of not hiding, could be a gift for others and for myself. I stood on a stage that fall, heart thumping in my chest, and spoke honestly about betrayal, about setting boundaries, about the cost and necessity of starting again. Afterward, a dozen people came up to thank me, sharing their own stories of loss and recovery. Each time, I recognized the same haunted hope I'd once seen in my own mirror. One afternoon, months after that first Monterey sunrise, I received a postcard from Linda. She had moved to Colorado, found a job as a receptionist at a medical office, was learning to take care of herself in ways she'd never bothered to before. Her words were cautious but genuine. She wished me well, thanked me for forcing her to face her own weakness, and hoped, someday, we might sit across a table and speak with kindness. I read it twice, 3 times, and then tucked it with the rest of the unsent letters. A testament to the truth that the past, while never undone, can be rewritten with humility. As the year turned and the ocean's mood changed with the wind, I realized that the life I'd built in Monterey was not an escape, but a homecoming. Not the home of family expectations or the burden of unspoken debts, but the home of a man who had survived heartbreak and found meaning in the simple fact of being alive and useful. The final act was not the grand gesture of vengeance, but the quiet courage to live without apology, to offer forgiveness without forgetting, to welcome the future as an uncertain and wondrous gift. In the early winter, Jacob visited for Thanksgiving. He brought a pie he'd baked himself, still a little lopsided, and we ate with Dan, trading stories and jokes that floated above old pain. Later, as we stood outside watching the moon pull a silver path across the black water, Jacob turned to me, not as a son begging, but as a man searching for connection. I placed a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, letting the silence speak the forgiveness words could never quite express. Life does not always give you justice, but sometimes it gives you peace, and if you're lucky, a second chance to make beauty from brokenness. I learned this in the hush of a dawn that belonged to no one but myself, on a coast where the waves erased the footprints of the day before. I am not the man I was, nor the one others tried to make me. I am the sum of every moment I chose myself, every act of dignity, every kindness, every painful goodbye. And when my story is told, I hope it is not just as a warning, but as a promise that it is never too late to begin again, to claim the life you were meant to live, and to offer, even after betrayal, the gift of mercy. First to yourself and then, when you are ready, to the world.